Good morning. Glad to have you this morning. And we have echo, so someone has to mute. Please, someone may need to mute.
AB is not awake yet.
It is, but it's better now, no?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, somebody is sitting there in the back.
Okay, thank you, whoever has fixed it. So I'm very happy to be here this morning, and my name is Sukaina Khan. I'm the Global Director for Fragility, Conflict and Violence Department at the World Bank. And I think today's subject is very relevant to the work that we're doing in the Fragility and Conflict group. So. And I think I'm very much looking forward to this session that I'm very happy to chair today. And thank you for asking me to be part of this discussion. And I think that all the 4 papers that we will see today, or at least we'll have a presentation on those 4 papers, they really bring with the structural change and conflict, but as well bringing us more data, right, to expand the methodological frontier on land use and conflict. And this is an area where we think that there's a knowledge gap, and I think those paper should help us close that knowledge gap. So let's suggest that we jump straight to the presentation, and I look forward to our discussion. The first paper will be presented by Erik. I hope I'm presenting you. Yeah, so I don't know which paper you have. We may have a slight change of order, but which is fine. And so Erik is here. Okay, so Erik is a postdoctoral scholar in the Institute of Economics and Econometrics at the University of Geneva. And you earned your PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2022. And previously Fulbright Research Fellow at Unicamp in Brazil. So you, without further ado, please start your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming at 8 a.m. on the third day. I appreciate getting up early. And I'm excited to, seems like it's working here. I'm excited to present today work that's co-authored with Fanny Moffett, focused on the political economy of land use and deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. So first of all, simplifying a little bit, but we can think that the major driver of deforestation and land use change in the Amazon is strong pressure to convert land to commodity agriculture. And so the main uses we can think of as cattle ranching and soy production. It's useful, and again, this is a bit of a simplification, but it's useful for today's presentation to think about these land use transitions occurring in 2 main stages. So the first, you can think about sort of, native forest being converted into low input, low productivity pasture, cattle pasture. And a second land use transition is from cattle pasture to much higher productivity, higher input soy. So we can see, of course, this first picture illustrating that first conversion to pasture. Often those cattle can be released onto the forest. It can still have lots of stumps and roots. And that second transition involves a lot of investments in preparing the soil, mechanized and chemical inputs, a lot of knowledge inputs that go into that, making that transition to a much higher return form of agriculture in soy production. So we know that these dynamics are connected with local politics as well. So there's several studies that have documented this. This first is a study by Paler showing that deforestation exhibits local electoral cycles, sort of spiking prior to municipal elections as mayors try to sort of gain the favor of rural voters. There's also a paper by Harding focused on the Colombian Amazon, showing that donor-funded mayors, who therefore sort of owe something back to their supporters, ease up on environmental restrictions and enable more deforestation. And finally, there's a paper focused on Brazil by Bragança and Dahis, published recently, showing that mayors who self-declare as farmers are associated with increased deforestation in a period in Brazil when there was weak environmental enforcement. And when federal environmental enforcement went up after 2004, it sort of took that power out of mayors' hands, and therefore you no longer see any effect of whether the mayor is a farmer or not on deforestation outcomes. So we know that these there is this connection, clearly, between local politics and land use. We also know this, of course, from ample anecdotal evidence. So anyone who's traveled in the region, talked to people, sort of understands that very commonly people will say, oh, of course, the mayor is a big landholder, right? Or, of course, landholders are important and powerful in our community, right? And so here's just some quotes from people describing these dynamics and describing how large agricultural producers are politically influential in the Amazon. So our main contribution to this topic really stems from bringing in novel data to study this in a way that was always difficult before because it was hard to observe or quantify these dynamics. So we contribute by building a novel panel of land use changes on the properties of all of the campaign local politicians and campaign donors in the Amazon over a 20-year period. Using these data, we contribute to three main strands of the political economy literature. So the first is about patronage, which basically is this idea of politicians paying back or rewarding their campaign supporters. So previous literature has documented patronage in terms of politicians giving public jobs or public contracts to their campaign supporters. And we showed that in a context where agriculture is really important. Donors might not necessarily want a public job or a public contract. They want help making valuable land use transitions on their properties. And we'll show that donors significantly increase soy cultivation while the candidate they supported is in office. So we show a channel of agricultural patronage. Secondly, we document that landholders are a powerful and widespread special interest group in the Amazon. So we'll show exactly sort of how many landholders are involved in politics, both as candidates and as donors. And we'll show as well that when mayors, so local politicians who receive large amounts of campaign financing from landholders, when they're elected, they govern in favor of landholders as a special interest group, promoting agriculture, and this includes negative environmental consequences. Finally, we'll engage with this question about politician identity. So several studies have looked, for example, at what happens when you elect different types of candidates to office, be that, for example, a high education candidate or a female candidate or a candidate of a specific ethnic group. So we're going to look at what happens when you elect sort of someone from a specific economic interest group, so landholders, and we'll largely find a null result. So it doesn't seem like landholders govern differently based on their identity. They do govern differently based on where their financial support for their campaign comes from. So first of all, this requires putting together a data set, and the first step is combining a variety of land registries for the Brazilian Amazon. So land titling and registration in the Amazon is sort of chaotic and incomplete, and there's a variety of overlapping registries, and so we combine three of the main ones. The first is from INCRA, and these are formal land titles. So this is legally sort of legal shape, file boundaries of people's properties. The second is Terra Legal, which is a specific government program designed to regularize land ownership and titling in the Amazon region. And the finally is CAR, which are self-declared property boundaries. And these are not legal title, but they are very useful and incentive compatible for landholders because they are really important in accessing rural credit and other sorts of benefits. And of course, all of these are very incentive compatible to get your name into these systems because this could potentially protect you from people coming onto your land or any sort of claim that could arise. These are sort of conflicting and overlapping, and so we have a procedure for sort of prioritizing and harmonizing these registries. The key factor behind all of these is we're able to put together identified versions that have people's names and social security numbers attached. As the end result is we have about 600,000 unique property boundaries, including people's names and ID numbers. We combine these identified property records with additional data sources. So first, we use remote sensing data from map biomas, which are 30 by 30 meter pixels, about land use change annually over a 20-year period. We also are able, because of the ID numbers, we're able to exactly match all of these land records with complete registries of everyone who participated in local politics, either as a candidate or a campaign donor over this 20-year period. See here. Yeah. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we're basically able to combine the land records with records of politicians, and of course we bring in a few extra data to look at things at the municipal level as well. So first of all, we learned some interesting descriptive evidence that was previously unavailable for the Amazon. So first of all, we learned that landholding is widespread amongst both politicians and donors, and this fits with our anecdotal understanding. So we matched 25% of winning candidates, so elected politicians, with land holdings, and about 8% of donors. So actually, I don't know if that's more or less than what your priors would have said for this region. But we're also able to sort of break it down by political party. This might not mean anything unless you're familiar with Brazilian politics. But what you can see from this is that the parties that we associate typically with the agribusiness lobby in Brazil are indeed the parties that have the largest share of landholders amongst their mayors and amongst their donors. We can see that parties that are sort of on the opposite end of the political orientation are indeed, like PSOL, are parties that don't have any landholders amongst their politicians or donors. And again, one interesting thing, so large landholders, those with more than 500 hectares of land, are 28 times overrepresented amongst mayors relative to their share of the population. So again, landholders are extensively involved in local politics. We also see that they're disproportionately large landholders, right? So we can see that this is especially clear amongst mayors. It's also clear amongst donors. But so the average landholding of a landholding mayor is about 1,500 hectares, right? So these are large, and there's many with holdings upwards of 2, 3, 4, 5,000 hectares. So very large landholders relative to the general landholding population. So turning more to our empirical strategy, or the first part of our empirical strategy, we're going to focus on property level effects of having local political connections on land use outcomes. And so the intuition here is we want to compare outcomes on the properties of donors to a candidate who barely won a close election relative to donors to a candidate who barely lost a close election. And we're going to estimate event studies around that close election outcome. So again, it's a pretty straightforward event study approach where you're treated if the candidate you donated to won the election, because now your candidate is in office for the next 4 years, and you're a control if you're also donated, but the candidate barely lost. We're going to use Callaway and Santana estimator because this is a context with stake or treatment timing. We're grouping together results from the elections in 2004, 8, 12, 16, et cetera. And again, we're going to restrict the sample around close elections where these outcomes are more as if random. I won't see if I have time to show here, but in the paper, we of course explore different cutoffs and actually find interesting things. If you look at very competitive elections, which you might think are a particular type of place that has competitive politics, and very uncompetitive places, which of course are a very different type of place with different political dynamics. So the first main empirical result here, this is again focused on donors' properties. And I want you to first look at these top 2 event studies. And so this is the amount of donors' land dedicated to pasture and soy. And so what we can see is that around the date when the politician enters office, they significantly shift land away from pasture. Again, this is like a low productivity form of agriculture towards soybean, which is a much higher input, higher productivity form. So this is what I would call agricultural intensification. One of our initial priors is that people might use this political, having this political friend in office to deforest more on their properties. And we really don't see that. So deforestation, maybe it increases a tiny bit, but we don't see really clear significant effects. Our interpretation here is that deforestation is largely regulated at the federal level and therefore mostly outside of mayors' control and ability to influence. So while mayors can promote agriculture, and I'll talk a lot more about what they could do to help farmers shift towards soy production, their hands are a bit tied in terms of enabling deforestation because this is sort of regulated and monitored at the federal level and theoretically should be really outside of mayors' ability to influence. If I zoom in at this top right figure, so the soy figure, and I break it down in sort of heterogeneity analyses, we can see 2 main takeaways. First of all, this change towards soy is driven overwhelmingly by the largest quartile of properties. So these are large landholders making very large donations who are getting this sort of help from the mayor, have this connection with the mayor. This makes sense. I'm not going to really go out of my way as a politician to help someone making a tiny donation, right? These are large landholders driving this. The thing we can see on the right is that the effect is driven entirely by first-time soy adopters, so people who had never planted soy prior to getting their candidate into office. And so basically our interpretation of this is that landholders are making a large one-time investment in political connections in order to facilitate this adoption of a new technology, which again has a lot of upfront adoption costs. I'll show later that basically people, after they make this successful donation, they stop donating. They donate about $7,000 in today's money, so it's a large amount of money. They get their candidate into office, they adopt soy, and they're kind of good to go. They don't donate anymore. Only 13% of them make a second donation after getting that first donation. So we interpret this as basically there's these barriers to adoption, and we interpret also this sort of continuing upward trajectory as evidence that once they overcome those barriers and adopt soy, that sort of sets them on a path, a trajectory that sort of they don't necessarily need continuous political support after that. So we also, sort of our first motivation in the project was really looking at mayors' own outcomes, sort of like, do people self-enrich or take advantage of political power while they're in office? It's a much smaller and more imprecise sample. There's a lot less mayors than there are donors. And so we really don't see much that's precise here, so I really won't interpret much of the findings. All I'll say is we don't find clear evidence that mayors are using their time in office, for example, to make major land use changes on their properties. We're next going to zoom out to the municipal level and try to understand, so we're seeing all of these donations from landholders occur. How does this affect municipal level outcomes in policymaking? And again, the intuition here is to compare outcomes in municipalities where different types of people are elected. So we're going to look at 4 separate treatment definitions. The first is whether a landholder is elected. The second is whether a large landholder is elected. And then whether a landholder who received more than 25% of their campaign donations, or someone who received more than 50% of these campaign donations from landholders. So these are what we would call landholder-financed candidates. Okay, and again, we're going to restrict these samples to close elections where the outcome of this type of candidate is sort of as if random. So I'm not sure if this is really readable from a distance, but if you focus on the top 2, these are coefficients from sort of separate regressions of these different treatment definitions. And the top 2 show the effect of electing a landholder or a large landholder to office on these different land use outcomes. And we can see that there's no effect. Okay, so electing a landholder, this type of person doesn't necessarily govern differently based on their personal identity as a landholder. However, if we look at the bottom 2 columns, or focusing on the third, which is people who got more than 25% of their donations from agriculture, we can see that electing this type of landholder-financed candidate leads to significant increases in municipal level soy, deforestation, and environmental violations. Okay, so electing someone who sort of owes their campaign support and has to pay back agriculture as a special interest group, we see these clear land use changes. So what is changing in terms of municipal governance that would drive these land use outcomes? Next, we're going to look at some mechanisms to try to understand. So we can see that electing a landholder-financed mayor, in the next 4 years, while that mayor is in office, we see that they spend significantly more on this category called agricultural promotion. So this is a municipal line item, which the mayor sort of can influence and decide how much they're spending relative to other categories. We don't really see any effects in terms of matching grants from the Federal Ministry of Agriculture, but we see, again, significant increases in the distribution of rural credit. So this is something that mayors theoretically shouldn't have a ton of influence over, but there's a variety of mechanisms through which the mayor can facilitate and encourage rural credit distribution within the municipality. So clearly this type of candidate is elected. They sort of owe their support back to agriculture, and they govern in favor of that group by promoting agriculture. So the question that arises is, are these mayors specifically targeting this support exactly back to their own donors, right? Or are they sort of just promoting agriculture broadly within the municipality? So previous literature on patronage, again, like I said, has shown that mayors give their campaign supporters public jobs or public contracts. And these are mechanisms that can be precisely targeted, right? I can give my exact donor a public job, a discretionary public job. In this context, mayors largely lack precise targeting mechanisms. So it's kind of hard within the institutional framework to exactly funnel rural credit or other benefits precisely to your donors. So we're interested in understanding how precisely can they target this. To do that, we decompose these total land use changes that I showed here, decomposing these into changes occurring on these 4 different types of properties. So these are the properties of candidates themselves, donors, other properties, and again, the black, so I guess 3 other groups, and the black is the aggregate effect that I showed before. So what we can see here is that these are clearly not precisely targeted back to donors, okay? So, for example, if we focus up on the top right, which is the effects on soy, indeed, so the blue is showing what I showed before. So soy goes up on donors' properties, right? But it's not only going up on donors' properties. There's large spillovers. In other words, there's sort of non-precise targeting to a bunch of other properties as well. Okay, and if we look at deforestation, this is sort of one of the interesting dynamics here. We can see that there's actually no deforestation occurring on donors' properties. That's what I showed you in the event studies. But there's these large spillovers and increased deforestation on non-donor properties. And because there's a lot more of those than there are donors, the overall municipal effect is an increase in deforestation. So that seems sort of contradictory, right? So why are we seeing deforestation going up on these other properties and not on donors' properties? Our interpretation is that, like I showed you before, donors are disproportionately large landholders, so they have much larger properties and much larger baseline cleared areas. So their properties basically have largely been cleared in the past. They're big agricultural producers, right? And so they're very interested in converting this low productivity pasture to high productivity soy. So they're really interested in this intensive margin, this intensification effect, and they're lobbying politicians to get this support. Politicians are promoting agriculture to pay back their donors, but all of these smaller properties have a lot more forest on their properties, and so this agricultural promotion leads to deforestation on these smaller properties. Soy is also a very scale-biased technology, so it really only makes sense to adopt soy on very large properties. And again, so when I promote agriculture, it has this heterogeneous treatment effect. When I promote it on large properties, it encourages conversion to soy. And when I promote agriculture on all of these smaller non-donor properties, it makes less sense to do soy on these properties, and they're engaging in deforestation, probably conversion to cattle pasture. So we do a bunch of robustness checks. Of course, we vary sort of the close election margins, our definition, whether we're focused on the Amazon biome or the legal Amazon region. A variety of other specifications are robust, are largely robust. Our results are robust to a lot of these changes. And so what are some of the main takeaways here? Again, the first is that a lot of these connections were just previously unobservable, right? So these are things that we could never study before without putting together the type of data that we've put together. So we've documented this channel of agricultural patronage, right? So donors clearly have this revealed demand for intensification, right? Conversion to soy, and they're investing large amounts of money in political donations to make this sort of transition. And like I mentioned before, these are like one-time donations, one-time investments. And once you've kind of gotten that support, again, this could be access to rural credit. It could be access to other factor markets. So we can think about inputs, experts and seeds and fertilizers and equipment, output markets as well, so access to the grain elevator, access to the buyers, infrastructure. These are all things that the mayor potentially could help with. They make these large donations, they get that friend in politics, and then they're kind of good. They stop donating for the large part after that. We also showed that there's this clear role of interest group influence. So landholders are widespread in politics and are an influential interest group. When mayors who they donate to are elected, those mayors govern in favor of agriculture as a special interest group, and this has negative environmental consequences. So thinking about some of the broader sort of policy implications of this research. First of all, there's several sort of recent studies that are highlighting agricultural intensification as sort of a way forward for Brazil, right? Or really any country, right? So theoretically, Brazil could convert massive amounts of existing cleared land to higher productivity forms of agriculture, produce way more, export way more, bring all of the economic development that brings with it without clearing another hectare of land. So theoretically, agricultural intensification sort of takes the pressure off of that extensive margin of new deforestation, and that seems like a great thing. Right? However, there's of course a number of potential downsides associated with that as well. So there's a few studies now showing that soy production and other sorts of intensive commercial agriculture in the Amazon is associated with really heavy chemical inputs, and this has negative health effects. This is also one of the contexts in the world with the highest level of land inequalities in the entire world. So if a land Gini for the Amazon is in many municipalities is above 0.8 or 0.85, right? So this is really exacerbating existing inequalities because I've showed you that it's the largest landholders, right? So first of all, donors are much larger than the average property holder. Second of all, the donors benefiting from these sorts of political quid pro quos are from the largest quartile of donors. So the ones getting this sort of unequal access to politics are disproportionately the largest landholders, and this could exacerbate inequality. And finally, there's this risk and this concern for indirect land use change. And we've actually shown a political mechanism underlying indirect land use change, right? So pressure from very large landholders to adopt soy encourages politicians to promote agriculture, which leads to conversion from forest to pasture on smaller properties. So we've really shown this political channel driving indirect land use change. And again, the final sort of concern here, thing for us to think about is that this inequality in access and influence politically can become a self-reinforcing thing, right? So landholders enrich through this process and become more influential, more involved in politics, which makes it more and more difficult, to sort of break this cycle. So these are just some of the costs and benefits of these sort of phenomena to consider. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Erik. The suggestion is just to have the 4 papers, and we can have question. We can take question now. After each one. Okay, so great. So, but we have to be mindful of time because 10 is. Okay. All right. So I see a lot of questions, hands already. I'm going to start, if you don't mind, by non-presenters, and then get to you. So you were first, and then the lady. So please, if you could just please introduce yourself and keep your question short, please, or observation.
Absolutely. This is a really interesting paper. My name's Matt Rebar. I'm a PhD candidate at Stanford University. So kind of at the core of this paper is close selection regression discontinuity design. That's kind of, you're estimating in a difference in difference framework, but this is what you're doing, is a close selection RDD. And so I was surprised that you didn't engage with any of the kind of recent methodological literature on close selection RDDs, which suggests that kind of what we're able to estimate with a candidate level close selection design is a compound average of different candidate characteristics, right? So there are a lot of things that we can think of kind of varying along with whether or not someone's a farmer. So kind of the classic example in this specific literature is, for instance, if you try and estimate the effect of electing a woman using this close election RDD, what you're actually estimating is a compound effect of being a woman and also competence, because voters tend to be biased against women, so women politicians tend to be a little bit more competent on the margin. So I think it would be, I hate to suggest adding a few more robustness checks, but I think this would be kind of improved by making reference to the kind of extensive literature which discusses this a lot. Sure. Thanks.
I suggest that we take all questions and get back to you for a response. Please.
Thank you, Erik. Congrats for your work. I could spend the whole day discussing it. I'm Brenda from Brazil, in Amazon. I have 2 questions. Did you capture any difference between municipalities in old and new deforestation frontiers over the years? So maybe for new frontiers, they would be more inclined to give these donations because they really want to expand or something like that. So, the second is, I'm assuming the answer is no, but could you identify any increase in the property size? Because I know that the data sets, especially from Terra Legal and INCRA, is probably like from 1 year, you can actually capture that, but from CAR, maybe in some states, if you have from different years, that could also be interesting to check whether donations are also related to increasing land property. I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Erik, for a really interesting paper. I'm Owen McGurk from Tufts, and I'll try to be quick. It's sometimes very difficult for me, but anyway. I guess there's 2 very different ways to think about the mayor's behavior here, and I'm trying to get a sense of whether you can distinguish between them, right? So it seems to me the first story is like the quid pro quo story, which it seems you're going for, right? That donors contribute to the politician, and the politician returns the favor. And this is a story where politicians are malleable and they respond to financial incentives, okay? And then a second story is that politicians are types and they have their own preferences and they're not malleable. And what the donors are doing is selecting their type, okay? And that's a very different interpretation. And I'm wondering, are you able to really distinguish between them? Or are your results consistent with both?
And we're going to take the last question.
Thank you. I enjoyed the presentation. My name is Anderson from Florida International University. I was thinking that if it's possible to analyze also what's going on with the use of this land on cattle, because I think that this is what is going on, at least in Colombia. Deforestation has been increasing in the last years, not because landowners are using this land for soy, but for cattle. And also, if it is possible, and I think that most of the deforestation that is going on in Colombia is in fallow land, not in land which is owned by big owners. And also, if it is possible to kind of do an heterogeneous analysis between those majors or or those municipalities in which indigenous communities are important, because maybe the ownership of this land is by the indigenous people, and they manage their own land regardless who was the mayor in this municipality. So these are my questions. Thank you.
Want to respond quickly?
Yes,
So,
please.
sure, thank you so much. These are all really, really good suggestions. We're definitely, I think, in the paper, a lot more, Matt, of the RD type checks and analyses come through. We've worked quite a bit on this, but your comments are very well taken, and we're still trying to work on sort of improving those. Brenda, thank you so much. The new old deforestation, I think, is a really interesting question. We haven't looked at that. I think it would be really nice to look at that. We see this clear spatial progression, right, where along the new frontier you have conversion to pasture, and along the old frontier you have, later down the line you have more conversion to soy. We do a heterogeneity analysis at the municipal level, where we look at sort of based on municipal development index, which captures to a large extent frontier versus more established. And you indeed see much more conversion to forest conversion on the less developed places, and much more conversion to soy on that sort of farther away from the frontier. Really quickly, Owen, about this is a great question. We're not really attacking this. I agree, it's super important. It's big in the political economy literature, right? People have whole papers trying to specifically exploit settings to disentangle these two things. I think we're kind of, I'm not making a super strong case which of the two. I think both are plausible. I don't know if we can precisely separate them. Both could fit this story. I mean, I agree it's a bit of a limitation. We can think about how implications would differ between the two. Let's see, finally, some really quick things. When I talk about pasture, Anderson, that's pretty much, we can think about, that's the cattle. So, right, so this first land use pasture is mostly for cattle production. Unclaimed land is super interesting. Tons of deforestation happens on unclaimed land. We're not looking at that. I mean, that does show up in the municipal level of, like those municipal values include all land use in the municipality, including unclaimed lands. On the property level analysis, we're not able to assign that unclaimed deforestation to a specific person. Indigenous communities manage land in a different system, so these would not show up amongst the private records that we're looking at here. But there's very different land use patterns on indigenous properties, and it would be cool to look at a municipality that hosts indigenous reserves versus one that doesn't. So that's a great idea. Thank you so much.
Please, another round of applause. That was quite fascinating to see the political economy of land. Now from Brazil, we're going straight to Indonesia with Tobias. Tobias is a PhD candidate at the chair of International Economic Policy at the University of Göttingen. And he's going to present the paper on land use transformation and conflict and through the lens of the effects of oil palm expansion in Indonesia. So like for the previous, we're going to let Tobias take us through the presentation and allow 10 minutes for Q&A. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. And I'm looking forward to present this paper to you on land use transformation and conflict. And this is joint work with Elias Cisneros and Christina Katovich. And so what we're trying to do in this paper is to kind of find an answer to the question whether agricultural commodity booms can cause violent conflicts. And if so, why this happens and under which conditions. And the answer to this question is actually not that straightforward. And so we are going to turn to Indonesia to try to find an answer for this puzzle. Indonesia is an excellent case study because it has seen one of the most significant, the largest agricultural commodity booms in recent decades with the expansion of oil palm plantations. Just provide you with a beautiful satellite photo of one of these newly established plantations in the middle of rainforest. But first, let's kind of go a little bit into the theory of why this question is actually kind of a puzzle. So when we think about a commodity boom, what you really think about is basically a sustained period of rapidly rising demand for a particular commodity, an agricultural one or a mineral or whatever. And what this does, to put it in very simple terms, is it creates a lot of rapidly increasing economic benefits for those producing this commodity. And the literature on conflicts has basically established two major, I would say, groups of mechanisms in these settings. So the first thing that happens is if economic returns from producing a certain commodity suddenly increase, then this reduces the likelihood of conflict because it increases the opportunity cost of violence. But at the same time, a very much opposite outcome is possible as well. So if these economic gains are not equally distributed and some groups win while some other groups lose, these suddenly materializing rents can create incentives to contest the distribution of these rents. And this has been coined as the rapacity effect, and it can lead to some very violent conflicts. And so to anyone working on conflict, this is not new. There's a big literature on this issue, and there's a lot of evidence that pretty much shows that both of these mechanisms are very relevant. However, if we're talking strictly about agricultural commodities, it's actually not that obvious. So the evidence is very mixed. We have findings going in many different directions. And so what we're trying to convince you here in this paper is that this has to do with something else that's going on. So if prices for an agricultural commodity increase, they do not only benefit the producers, but they also create strong incentives to expand production of this commodity, to engage in land use change and basically convert new areas to expand plantation in our case. And so there is some theoretical literature on this issue, and it basically tells us that we can expect to see conflicts in such a setting. So this can lead to competition for land, especially if land is scarce already or is becoming increasingly scarce. And also, it's very likely that different groups benefit in a very different way from this. This can lead to social grievances, and even there's a literature saying environmental grievances, so people just opposing a conversion of forests. And on the second, well, there's a lot of empirical evidence on the first question. On the second question, this is kind of surprisingly more of a new field in economics, so there's not that much yet, and I think Owen is going to present some findings on this question of land competition and conflict just after me. But one reason for why it's kind of difficult to disentangle this is that we have a very strong reverse causality problem in this setting. Land expansion and especially agricultural investments tend to happen in more peaceful areas. There's a lot of papers showing that wars, conflicts can act as a deterrent force on agricultural investments. And so in this paper, we're turning to the setting of Indonesia because it's quite unique in that it helps us to disentangle this issue a little bit. So the first thing that's a bit special, or maybe not, about the Indonesian case is that the oil palm boom in Indonesia very strongly followed global rising demand and also national level political incentives. So at the local level, we kind of exploit this as being more or less exogenous if we look at very specific locations. And the second property of oil palm production is that there's actually a very substantial time delay between land conversion for oil palm and when these palms are tall enough to be harvested and actually economic rents materialize. And this helps us to separate these effects of the land conversion and whatever happens once plantations become productive and how basically already producing areas respond to changing economic conditions. And we're going to do this by basically building a panel with spatial temporal data on violent conflicts event in Indonesia that we connect with remotely sensed oil palm plantation maps and with indicators of pressure, incentives to expand plantation areas and economic shocks in these areas. And to just foreshadow some of what we're going to find is we do see that pressure to create new plantations in Indonesia is strongly predictive of local conflicts breaking out. And at the same time, there is evidence for this very classic opportunity cost mechanism in areas that already produce oil palm for some time. We see that price shocks, positive shocks reduce conflicts, negative shocks increase conflicts, very much in line with the literature. Okay. Yeah, there's a bunch of kind of strands of literature that we're trying to connect to with this paper. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time now. So first, let me tell you just a little bit more about the context here. Indonesia has seen a major commodity boom in the past 2, almost 3 decades now, with the oil palm boom. And you can see Indonesia here in blue in this graph showing the production quantity of palm oil by country on a global scale. And as you can see, between 2000 and close to today, Indonesia increased its palm oil production by more than 4 times. So this was a massive boom, and today the oil palm plantation industry occupies almost 9% of the country's land area, so it's really, really massive. And there's ample literature showing us that for Indonesia overall, economically, this has been a huge success story. So it has helped millions of people out of poverty. It has led to a lot of economic development, and has generally, from an economic point of view, it was a very good thing. But at the same time, it's associated with many, many issues. I think what we're all familiar with is deforestation. So a lot of these new plantations were established on what was peatlands and tropical rainforests on those peatlands. So the adverse consequences for the environment were really, really terrible. This has gotten better in recent years, so there's some hope at least. At the same time, the oil palm industry has been involved in some major corruption scandals, and there is increasingly anecdotal, qualitative, and also some descriptive empirical evidence that this oil palm boom is associated with social conflicts, with land disputes, and even with violence. So to just give you an example, how violent this can be is that some of these land conflicts, in this case between a plantation and some local villagers in a rural area, they can turn very violent. So here we had a violent clash between plantation security forces and villagers that resulted in the death of 7 people. And this is not an exception. So this happens, or did happen quite frequently in Indonesia. And in 2012, the National Land Agency, well, kind of acknowledged that there were at least 4,000 ongoing land disputes related to palm oil. And how many exactly of those turned violent, we do not know, but many did. Yeah, some more beautiful pictures just setting the stage about land conflict in Indonesia. But basically now going to the data that we're going to be using in this setting. So the Indonesian setting is a bit special in that for Indonesia, very detailed and data on conflict is available. So this was a project that was actually financed by the World Bank a little bit more than 10 years ago, so thank you for that. That basically went through the effort of encoding violent events from newspaper reports for more than 15 years, starting in the late 90s and until 2015. Out of this, we're focusing on the period between 2005 and 2014, which is basically the 10 years for which the violence reporting was consistent. And what they did was basically encode newspaper reports, geocode them to the level of sub-districts, and in some cases even individual village, assign a date, and code the different types of conflicts. So was it a conflict over land? Was it an identity-related conflict to ethnicity or whatever? And also provide short incident descriptions that we can leverage to understand a bit better what was going on specifically. Out of these 160,000, they include a lot of violent crime as well. So we just focus on a subset of those that are specifically coded as conflicts. We geolocalize them to Indonesian sub-districts, which is the third level administrative division in Indonesia. And we only look at rural areas. And this gives us a panel of 2,755 units that we can track over 10 years. And roughly a third of those have a conflict incident each year in our data. As you can see in this map, we can only cover about 50% of Indonesia. The simple reason for this is that the NVMS data set only covered about half of Indonesia's provinces consistently. So we just restrict our sample to that, basically. Now, to measure oil palm plantation expansion, so The one thing we do is we just rely on remotely sensed plantation maps by Gavot et al. Basically, this is very precise annual maps telling us where plantations were created, what their extent was, and also whether it was a company-driven plantation development or smallholder plantation. And we, again, aggregate this at the level of individual sub-districts. You can see that there was a lot of variation, but most of the expansion happened on two of Indonesia's islands, Sumatra and Kalimantan, which is the Indonesian part of Borneo. Then we supplement our data with many other data sources. So we use the Indonesian village census that is conducted every few years to include some socioeconomic characteristics for these sub-districts. We have data on droughts, on forest cover, on remoteness, and many, many more. Okay, now coming to a bit more technical part of this whole issue is how can we actually capture incentives to convert new land for plantations? It's not super straightforward, but what we do here follows a very simple intuition. So what we basically do is we argue that oil palm expansion happened in cycles. They followed global prices. There was more expansions when prices were high, but also when the political environment in Indonesia was kind of pushing for more oil palm because this was heavily enforced politically. And our argument is whenever more expansion happened overall, because prices were high, incentives were very strong, then most of this expansion would have happened wherever there is land available that's suitable for high-yield oil palm cultivation. So yeah, we use soil suitability for oil palm production from the FAO to basically capture this location-specific exposure to these national level incentives. So the simple intuition really is if a lot of expansion happens, if pressure to expand plantations is strong, then this will happen wherever suitable land is available. Available in the sense that it is not yet converted to oil palm and it is not covered by settlements, water, and so on. Yeah, so we supplement this panel with some data on price shocks in previously established producing areas, but I'll keep this short. And okay, so what do we actually estimate in this setting? So the first thing that we're going to be looking at is just a simple connection between the remotely sensed oil palm plantations, so the actual plantations that happened. Obviously, this is kind of endogenous because where plantations were created is not exogenous. And how this connects to conflict in a two-way fixed effects panel regression controlling for remoteness, because this affects both the reporting of violence and also the locations of where plantations were established. And then in a second step, we're going to use our indicator of expansion pressure, expansion incentives, as a predictor for conflict incidents. And in a third step, at the same time, we're going to look at the impacts of price shocks in previously established producing areas to kind of separate these two channels. So first, some just very basic descriptive evidence on the whole thing. This is just simple means of conflict probabilities in each sub-district separated by suitability for oil palm. And what you can see is basically that at the start of our period, again, this is just purely descriptive, in areas that had a high suitability for oil palm cultivation, we see quite rapid increases in the likelihood of conflict events being reported. So these two regions of the country really diverge quite strongly. The same is true to some degree for areas that had already some established plantations. But now coming to our first main result, okay, let's look at the first row here. So this is basically just regressing the local likelihood of conflict on a simple dummy capturing whether any remotely sensed plantation expansion happened in a given year in a given location. And what we can see is if we only include province fixed effects in our model, is that any plantation expansion in a given location in a given year is associated with a 6 to 7% increase in the likelihood of conflict being reported. Compared to the baseline of 28%, this is actually quite substantial. This effect vanishes when we only look at the within sub-district variation. But again, here we have reverse causality issues, so it wasn't entirely surprising to us. However, now going to the third row, which is basically the effect of our measure of expansion pressure. And we see that this is a very, very strong predictor of conflicts breaking out at the local level. And in our preferred specification in the third column, the estimate basically tells us that incentives to convert 1% of the area of a given subdistrict to plantations in a given year is associated with an increase in the probability of local conflicts by 19 percentage points. Yeah, so it's very substantial effect. Okay, now looking at what happens in areas that already have plantations. So for this, we augment our specifications with this measure of price shocks and economic shocks in previously established plantation areas. And if we just look at the first column, we see that we get a negative sign here. So price shocks in established production areas seem to reduce conflicts. However, once we disentangle this between positive and negative shocks, we find that this is very much, the sign is very much driven by sudden price drops increasing conflicts where plantations are already productive. Very much in line with opportunity cost predictions from the literature. We can do the same thing using a different measure of economic shocks by looking at droughts. If we just look at the last column here, we see pretty much the same pattern. If a drought strikes a established oil palm production area, conflicts increase. Okay, so these results are quite robust to a broad variety of robustness checks. So they do not depend on how exactly we specify expansion pressure. This only affects the magnitude. So as long as we use suitability and available land to capture where expansion is going to happen, and we use some time varying measure of incentives, we can also use prices if some of you prefer that, and we find the same results. This is not driven by general agricultural suitability either. So we checked that, we created the same price exposure measures, expansion pressure for other crops as well. We do not find any significant results and so on. Okay, and now just to go a little bit into the mechanisms for the 2 minutes that I have left. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try to stress the point that this is really about the economic potential of these new lands. And what we do to kind of establish this point is we conduct a heterogeneity analysis using various different proxies for, let's say, the importance of land in a given subdistrict. The first one is just going to be how much land is still available at the start of our observation period. And what we see here is that basically in regions where land was still plentiful, this conflict effect is kind of mitigated. So apparently conflicts are worse in areas where land was already scarce. A second proxy for basically alternative income sources that we use is whether a subdistrict had any mining, oil, or gas concessions, so just other sources of income in very rural areas. And we see that this strongly mitigates this effect of expansion pressure for oil palm. The same is true if we look at subdistricts that, according to the village census, had a very low dependence on farming because maybe they had some other industries. Yeah. So the effects are generally weaker where land is less scarce and less relevant as an income source. Now, what we can also do is to kind of dig a little bit more into this fine-grained conflict data and disentangle our finding by the different types of conflict that we actually see reacting to this pressure to expand plantations. And if we just look at the first major category, this is coded as resource conflicts, and those are basically the ones that very strongly drive this effect, and among those especially increases in land conflicts. And the second category that is affected by expansion pressure is election conflicts. Might sound puzzling, but to anyone familiar with the Indonesian context, it's actually not surprising at all. Within those election conflicts, the entire effect basically comes from district-level elections. So the thing is, in Indonesia, the districts were the ones, or district mayors were in charge of land use decisions and of granting concessions to companies throughout the period that we observe here. And finally, we see one category, popular justice. It's kind of a fuzzy conflict category. It captures basically retaliation of groups against single individuals for a perceived injustice or crime. And all of the other categories of conflict, I've grouped them here, but they're also insignificant individually, do not respond to this measure of expansion pressure. So I think, how am I doing on time? 1 minute, okay. Then I'm just going to skip this for now. We have some, okay, I'm not going to skip it. So if we only look at resource conflicts here, because for the other types of conflicts, we do not find this heterogeneity, we actually see that these conflicts are mitigated in areas that have a higher share of private land. This is kind of consistent with an issue that has basically been mentioned in qualitative studies about the Indonesian context, that public or common village lands were very often sold off to companies by village heads without the consent of their communities. At the same time, it's not a super strong result in terms of significance, but what we can also see is that, again, the effect of expansion pressure seems to be somewhat mitigated in areas where the share of owner-cultivated land was higher relative to land owned by landlords. So in a way, wherever land distribution was somewhat more equal, if we believe that this is a proxy of equal land distribution, these conflict effects are mitigated. I'm going to skip this for now. Yeah, we checked some other mechanisms. So is this effect mitigated through local development, electrification? Is it related to population growth, to ethnic grievances, and even to environmental grievances? We do not really find anything there. And finally, to kind of conclude this, because this is a question that sometimes comes up, why do we even see violent conflicts in this setting? Because people could bargain, people could come to an agreement of how they distribute these lands, and we're good, basically. But in Indonesia, this is not that easy. And again, we're here in a post-colonial settings where land rights situations are very, very complicated. The land rights situation in Indonesia is very weak and intransparent, especially in a large part of the country that is categorized as the so-called forest estate, where the state has basically full control and individual ownership of land is prohibited. So local communities very much live in these lands, but once plantations come in and got a concession from the government, then they have basically no way of opposing that in a court because they can't have legally lay claim to this land. Now, a lot of this is being addressed to recent land reforms in Indonesia, so we can hope that this will improve in the future. And finally, there's evidence, anecdotal, about corruption and rent-seeking among community leaders, local politicians, authorities, that lead to feelings of betrayal and failed mediation. Yeah, so to just sum up briefly, the oil palm boom in Indonesia is linked to violent conflicts at the local level. We see an opportunity cost effects in areas where plantations are already established, and an expansion pressure effect that creates conflicts in areas where there are strong incentives to basically expand these plantations. And I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tobias. I think we could probably have the same conclusion in many other countries, because when we do our risk and resilience assessment to understand the drivers of fragility, this comes, but not as precise as you've been able to show it, in particular that it can be a predictor, that expansion can be a predictor of conflict. So with that, we have 10 minutes. Could you please come closer to the mic? 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm gonna, yeah. If you could please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I'm Christoph Kubitzer from the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. So I have one question concerning the transmission mechanism. So suitability is not actually only influencing the oil palm plantations, the expansion, but also where intended investments go. So companies were also trying to get locations permits, also sometimes for speculative purposes in areas that were suitable for oil palm. And we know that a lot of these location permits never went actually in production, and actually this year or last year, the Indonesian government revoked a lot of them because they were actually never developed. But still, like, these location permits sparked a lot of conflict because people were knowing that somebody is investing there. And there were already like, then in the villages, there were some people trying to get take advantage of the situation, and also outside. But this runs, of course, then not so much through the price of the produce. Although you could say, like, if they do it for speculative purposes, they would maybe rather than invest if prices go up. But still, it's a different mechanism compared to when you look at the actual oil palm expansion. So that would be my question, if you considered that like a little bit how that worked, because sometimes I think like the intention of investment is all like a big driver of conflict, not only when the investment is actually happening on the ground.
Thanks so much, Tobias. This is amazing research. Robert Hellmeyer from UC Santa Barbara. I'm curious, so maybe two ideas of a further mechanism and potentially a moderating effect. So one idea would be to look at heterogeneity across the corporations that are active within a subdistrict. I'm curious, a lot of corporations have made commitments to free, prior, informed consent. And so I'm curious whether you might see some moderating impact if you have companies operating in a district that are more committed to engaging with communities to avoid conflict. That might give a really interesting kind of policy relevant insight. The second idea is on the mechanisms. Maybe this is what you hinted at with some of your null results, but I'm curious whether migration is at all kind of an influence. There's increasing research that these palm oil booms have led to lots of migration into districts, and so that might be an important source of conflict.
Owen.
Just a very quick one. This is really interesting stuff, Tobias. I have a question about your use of the price data, and I'm sorry if you mentioned this already, but is Indonesia really a price taker? And if not, then that price variation will be endogenous, right? So are you worried about that? And maybe one potential solution is you could use variation in big weather events in other producing countries, because that would give you variation in prices that's potentially exogenous to conflict in Indonesia.
Okay, Tobias.
Okay. Thanks for these questions. All super relevant. So, Christoph, maybe to start with yours first. Yes, absolutely. So this is something that we discuss in the paper. For sure, land expansion, or yeah, there were these investments that never materialized, right? We can't measure that, really, unfortunately. We would love to have data on that. But essentially, the point we're making is suitability should capture these investments implicitly, in a way. We're not restricting our analysis to places that actually saw plantation expansion. So we're basically just making the argument, if areas were suitable, they experienced this pressure for actual land conversion or just for land investments in a way. Yeah, I hope that kind of addresses your question in a way. Then Robert, yes, so heterogeneity across corporations, that's an amazing idea. I don't have data on that, but maybe you do. So I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards about this. Yeah, we would love to show that it really depends on what type of corporation is acting here. But just to be clear about this one point, this entire thing is not only driven by corporations. So we actually see a lot of these conflicts being related to fights among smallholder farmers and within communities. Yeah. And the second thing, migration. So we don't have great migration data at this level. Maybe we can go up to the sub-district level to come up with a proxy. So what we used is population growth, arguing that kind of out of way above average population growth must be related to migration to a local sub-district somewhat, but we don't find anything there. We were quite surprised because we had a strong prior that this should explain some of these effects. Yeah. And finally, yes, Indonesia very much has an influence on global markets because they make up for 50% of global palm oil production. But this is actually much less of a concern, we argue, than one might expect, because palm oil is a very close substitute for all or many other vegetable oils. So we could see this from palm oil prices rising due to the war in Ukraine, because sunflower seed and rapeseed oil prices suddenly rose as well. And again, due to this time delay between an expansion of production and when oil palm actually yields fruit, Indonesia has very limited ability to manipulate prices in the short run. So we're not too concerned that this is a big issue over our 10-year period of observation. But the point with using maybe variation in weather shocks in other producing areas is a great suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tobias. So now we're moving to Africa on what Owen calls development mismatch, and based on study on agriculture projects in pastoral Africa. So another area where for us we see significant drivers of fragility, broadly conflict between herders and farmers, but I think Owen will give us, will help us to disentangle this. Over to you, Owen.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation to speak at this really great event. This is co-authored work with Nathan Nunn, and I should say, much like Tobias's paper, this is very much a paper with kind of heterogeneous effects and winners and losers, and hopefully a suggestion of a potential policy solution. So this isn't a totally bad news paper. That said, here are two motivating observations for this project. The first motivating observation is that we know, and we're beginning to learn more and more, that local context is really important for the success or failure of development policies, right? So there exists some degree to which policies are well matched or mismatched with local populations for a variety of reasons, okay? The second motivating observation is that we, most of us in this room, we understand the development process as being that first step in structural transformation, right? The step from an agrarian society to an industrial society. And because of that, we have a shared imperative to raise the productivity of crop agriculture, which is very difficult and proving difficult in Africa. And this will imply expanding commercial agricultural land use, okay? So for very good reason, this is something that we care about. Our main motivating insight, for want of a better word, is that for much of Africa's population and for even more of Africa's land, the existing mode of subsistence is not crop agriculture at all. It's pastoralism. And so the question that we ask in this paper is very straightforward. What happens when an agricultural development project is implemented in a traditionally pastoral territory, right? That's what we're trying to understand in this paper. To give you a little bit of background, so Africa has a sizable pastoral population. These numbers are actually originally from the African Union, but they're republished in an FAO report in 2018. So they estimate that maybe a fifth or just over a fifth of Africa's population obtains the majority of its income from animal husbandry. And that pastoralism takes place on about 43% of Africa's landmass. Okay, so pastoralism is practiced in really large tracts of semi-arid land that's not very productive for any other type of subsistence mode. So many pastoral groups, we don't have a brilliant handle on how many, are what we call transhumant. This means that they migrate between seasons. Okay, so they'll graze in pastoral semi-arid areas in the wet season, and then they'll migrate to adjacent farmland for the dry season. And this is something that benefits farmers and herders, okay? Sometimes called the symbiotic relationship. We know it as production complementarities, right? So the herders benefit because their animals graze in the more sort of fertile farmland in the dry season, and the farmers benefit because this makes agriculture more productive the next year because of the organic fertilizer, okay? So because of this production function, pastoralists rely on highly flexible customary land use arrangements, right? They're mobile between seasons, they're also mobile within seasons, right? So the idea of fixed title on a parcel of land that we've been talking about all week, that just doesn't wash in this context, right? That doesn't match the production function. So it's customary land use arrangements that are updated within seasons and between seasons. The second important implication of this production function is that it requires cooperation with those neighboring farmers, right? With the sedentary agriculturalists. And then I have a ... there because, as most of you know, this cooperation seems to be breaking down across large parts of Africa. And herders and farmers seem to be fighting a lot. So it's very important to understand, why is there conflict between farmers and herders? Usually if you present a conflict paper in front of economic theorists, they'll tell you your paper's wrong because conflict can't exist. It's so inefficient. Okay, so this is the case where conflict is happening between groups that share production complementarities, which is an even bigger puzzle. Okay, so we're focusing on one very specific story in this paper. And I could pick many examples, but I'm just going to pick a story from The Guardian from a few years ago. So the headline here is "Nightmare for Ethiopian Pastoralists as Foreign Investors Buy Up Land." And the causal sort of chain that's being described in this article is that the government clears land for a commercial agricultural plantation, land that was previously used for pastoralism. The pastoralists are displaced, and then there's conflict between pastoralists and farmers because it disrupts the equilibrium that was there, okay? So here you have large-scale plantations. It makes important grazing lands unavailable, and then the displaced Suri, that's the pastoral group, that escalates violent conflict between them and the DZ, which is the neighboring agricultural group. A couple of other interesting things from this article in The Guardian. They talk about the first episode being something fairly minor, where 3 DZ, so that's the agricultural group, 3 DZ police officers are killed, and it occurred over the police marking, a potential expansion of the plantation, so very, very early in the process. And then there's a big government retaliation with 54 unarmed Suri killed in a marketplace. And then the final interesting part of this Guardian article is that they sort of implicate the West, right? Because the World Bank provided some support for this project, so that implicates Western funds in the core settlement of pastoral communities. Now, you could pick many stories in different countries with different funders: Senegal, other parts of Ethiopia, Kenya, northern Ghana, bilateral aid, other multilateral aid. It's not specific to any country or funder, okay? The basic idea is commercial agricultural plantation occurring in a pastoral area, and the absence or insufficient compensation for the pastoralists who were there. So why is this happening? So what's kind of interesting is just to dip into the case study literature, the journalistic accounts, the ethnographic accounts. What are the beliefs that are leading to these policies that are enacted? So you can, this is very sort of rough and unscientific, but on one side you could say, from the perspective of states and donors, these agricultural projects ought to foster prosperity and peace. Commercial agriculture should be very productive. But you also have this sort of thread going through some of these rationales where pastoralists are viewed to be baffling, unruly, threatening and backward, archaic, and in need of sedentary modern lifestyles, okay? And then the counterpoint, so there's a nice picture of an agricultural project in a semi-arid area that provides employment to refugees. The counterpoints then, again, this is coming from the case study literature, are firstly that some of these agricultural projects undermine the existing pastoral system for the reasons that we saw in the Guardian article. This can be due to outright displacement or to blocking access to really important water points or pasture. And then a kind of similar but not quite the same argument is that a lot of these agricultural projects are not themselves profitable in these semi-arid areas, right? So these are very challenging places for commercial agriculture because they're semi-arid. And so what we're trying to find out in this paper is, well, what mix of stories aligns with the data in a systematic way, right? So does the expansion of agriculture into pastoral territories lead to peace and prosperity, as promised, or does it lead to violence or some combination of both, right? So that's what we're trying to figure out. This is probably a terrible idea, but let's do 2 slides of just thinking about the rationale from the perspective of the government, okay? So what I'm trying to show here is this need not imply conflict at all. So let's say you have a continuum from north to south. In the south, agriculture is more productive, and in the north, pastoralism is more productive. So at baseline, that L star is like the optimal border between the 2 modes of subsistence. So let's say we come in with a crop agriculture project. This could be a new seed variety or something that just increases the productivity of agriculture all over. What does that do? That creates a new optimal boundary at L prime. And so the segment between L0 and L prime is optimally converted from pastoralism to agriculture, okay? Or it could be the case that it's just a more sort of localized project, like an irrigation project, that'll have the same effect, right? You have that segment that was optimally used for pastoralism is now optimally used for agriculture. And the puzzle that arises here is that we have a surplus, right? Let's go back to Econ 101. There's a surplus there that can be used to compensate the losers. So the compensation could be in the form of a transfer that avoids conflict, or it could be like a reallocation across sectors. So the herders become farmers in the new plantation the next day. But theoretically, there's nothing here to suggest that conflict is something that ought to necessarily happen, right? And then you have these on-the-ground accounts. So this is Zambakari writing about Sudan, and he makes 3 observations about why this isn't happening, right? So number 1, pastoralists are vulnerable to expropriation because of those customary land use arrangements that I told you about, okay? Number 2, they are being evicted because of these commercial agricultural projects. And then number 3, this is leading to violence because they are resorting to violence. They don't have much political power. They tend to be minority groups. And we know that minority groups have strong incentives to fight in the absence of power sharing, right? So that's sort of the 3 steps arguing against that perfect Coasian, frictionless model that we looked at a few minutes ago, okay? So just in the interest of compiling all of these potential outcomes, so you have the Kosian world, number one here, which is these projects bring development and no conflict because the pastoralists are not worse off, they're compensated, okay? So that's the Pareto improvement, everyone benefits. Scenario two is the project generates surplus, but for whatever reason, the pastoralists are worse off. They're not compensated, okay? In the interest of completeness, scenario three is that the projects just aren't profitable, right? One of the case studies suggested that these things just don't work. So the project is unprofitable. The pastoralists are not worse off because if the project is not profitable, the farmers can exit. And then the fourth one, which seems to be a little less likely altogether, is that these projects could be unprofitable and yet the pastoralists are still worse off. But again, we think that's unlikely because the farmers can exit in the event that the projects are unprofitable, okay? So what's the case study? What is the hypothesis arising from the case studies? Number one, that the project does lead to conflict, okay? Because the pastoralists lack property rights, they lack political power. And then part two, then conditional on the first prediction, is that if the projects lead to conflict, we think scenario two is a lot more likely than scenario four, right? Why would there be conflict over something if the farmers don't value the land themselves, okay? So that's how we're thinking about this. On the data side, so I'm very conscious that I'm at the World Bank and we're going to be using World Bank data on projects. And we're also going to, the data is going to be organized by Aid Data and Ariel's sitting over there. So I better not make any big mistakes. So we have a panel data set, 10,000 0.5 degree cells for each year covering all of Africa. The cells I'll denote by I. These are nested within traditional pre-colonial ethnic territories from the Murdoch map. Our outcome variable is just an indicator for conflict incidence, equal to 1 if there's at least one conflict event in the cell year, equal to 0 otherwise. And then we have our measure of transhuman pastoralism, which we created in a previous paper. The information comes from the ethnographic atlas. It's an index from 0 to 1, capturing the extent to which an ethnic group is traditionally mobile and relies on large animal husbandry. Okay, so this is our measure of transhuman pastoralism. That's a map of our transhuman pastoralism index. But let's get into the development project data. So again, we did not set out to write a paper about the World Bank at all. They're a victim of their own transparency and very carefully labeled data, which is really nice for researchers because it's all off the shelf. We are in the process of getting more development project data from bilateral aid and other multilateral institutions as well. But for now, we're just going to use this. So this is geo-coded World Bank development project data. This has data on over 60,000 development project sites from 1995 to 2014. And what's very useful for us is we have off-the-shelf information on sectors and categories, right? So in Africa, we have just under 15,000 project sites. We have 26% of those are coded as being agriculture, okay? Within agriculture, and this is very helpful for us, we have crop agriculture and we have pastoral projects, which is animal production. A very small number of these projects are pastoral, and you can see from the numbers there that whenever pastoral projects do happen, they tend to be paired with crop agriculture, right? So 4 and 26 does not equal 26. That's because the animal production projects happen with the crop agriculture projects. What's going to be really helpful for us in terms of identification is we also have our placebo non-agricultural projects, right? So think of electricity, communications, transport, education, health, whatever, okay? That's all under non-agriculture. And I won't get into this, but we have a way of estimating the earliest possible date at the start of the planning process for these projects, right? Because we want to get the earliest point that we can. Let me skip here. Here's an example of one project. This is the really large rice project in Mopti in Mali. There isn't one representative project, but you can get a sense from here that these are very large, right? This is something that is preparing 13,000 hectares for rice boulders. So let me just say briefly how, or at least what I'm going to limit today's talk to. Our identification strategy is just multi-way differencing. We're just going to try to difference out as much as we possibly can. And we'll change our assumptions in each specification, and we'll see how convinced we are afterwards. So I'm going to start with raw data. Raw data is yet to be cancelled. Fixed effects in progress, and event study plots to sort of check out pre-trends. So in this picture, I'm just showing you average conflict incidence across all cells relative to the implementation of a crop agricultural development project, okay? In the next slide, I'm going to separate cells between pastoral, which is going to be light blue, and agricultural, which is going to be in orange. Okay? So when you make that separation, you can see the blue dots seem to increase after a crop agricultural development project is implemented, and the orange dots seem not to increase. Okay? So blue before after is within pastoral areas, orange before after is within agricultural areas, and the difference in differences is what you're eyeballing there. That's what we're going to try to estimate afterwards. Okay? Now, I mentioned our placebo projects, the non-crop agriculture, the education, health, transport, and so on. So if we swap from crop agriculture to non-agriculture, we don't see the same change happening in blue areas relative to orange areas, right? So that's crop agriculture, and that's non-agriculture, okay? Here's the regression version of the same thing. So it's the two-way fixed effects. I think it's interesting first to think about that beta 2 on agricultural projects. So that's the diff and diff effect of an agricultural project in an agricultural area, which is an interesting parameter in and of itself, okay? We're interested in beta 1, which is conceptually a triple difference, right? Because beta 2 is a diff and diff. So beta 1 is a triple difference, which requires fewer identification assumptions, not more, right? So beta 1 actually allows for time-varying selection bias that is specific to agricultural projects, but our assumption is that it's common between agricultural areas and pastoral areas, right? That's the identification assumption. So let's just focus on column 1, which is the main UCDP conflict variable, which has a nice long time series from 1989 to 2015. So two things that sort of jump out straight away. First, maybe the good news is that an agricultural project in an agricultural area significantly reduces the likelihood of conflict, okay, by 1.65 percentage points. You can see in pastoral areas, we see the reverse. We see that it increases conflict. And to give you a sense of the numbers in that middle panel, we compute the total effect in a typical pastoral area. So a typical pastoral area has an index score of 0.6. And so when you get the total effect there, you can see that a project increases conflict by about 4.2 percentage points. In the next slide, we're going to separate the agricultural project into crop agriculture versus animal production. We have a very, very clear prediction on where the action should be coming from. And we see that it's all coming from crop agriculture and not the animal production. What is maybe surprising, certainly very interesting, is that we see the opposite effect of pastoral projects. So what this is telling us is that when a crop agricultural project is paired with the pastoral project, our effects are 0. And that's actually a very well estimated 0, p-value of 0.92. So it completely mutes the negative effect or the deleterious effect of the crop agricultural project, okay? And then our placebo check, what happens when you put in a non-agricultural project, no significant difference between pastoral and non-pastoral areas. And then we can compare those two triple differences with a totally different identification assumption, allowing for time-varying selection bias in pastoral areas. That's common between projects. And we see that there's a significant difference between those two. I have 3 minutes to go, so I'm going to leap straight to, so here are actually some important event study pictures. This is just the agricultural sample. You can see a slight decline in conflict that sort of occurs gradually in line with the opportunity cost story that Tobias explained to us. Here's the diff and diff, or the event study picture within pastoral areas, and then here's our pooled effect. And there's a Callaway and Santana. So let me jump straight to the development outcomes, which is still preliminary. This is using nightlights data. Okay, we're in the process of connecting this with survey data to get a better sense on development outcomes. But what's fascinating about the result on nightlights, and if we take nightlights to be a decent proxy of economic development, we see a positive effect in both pastoral and non-pastoral areas. So the picture on the left is the pastoral cells, picture on the right is non-pastoral cells, right? So the overall picture is that these projects reduce violence and increase nightlight luminosity in agricultural areas, and increase violence and increase nightlight luminosity in pastoral areas. Okay, so in line with that scenario too. And then the final thing to show you, I promised I'd end on hopefully a positive note. We saw evidence of a potential Coasian solution when the crop agricultural projects are paired with pastoral projects. And so the question then becomes, when does that happen? And we have evidence to suggest that that happens when pastoralists have more political power. Okay? So when pastoralists have more political power, our effects are closer to 0. And the final part of the puzzle is that when pastoralists have more political power, we're more likely to see animal production projects paired with the crop agricultural projects. So a Coastian solution can exist, and it's more likely to happen when everyone has a seat at the table, when pastoralists have more political power. Okay? And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we're going to take a few questions, but I have myself, I have myself as well some questions for you, because I think after 2014, I think the study covers until 2014, right?
I think that's our last year.
Yeah.
That's our last year.
So the dynamic of conflicts has changed quite significantly in many parts of Africa after 2014. That's one. So it would be interesting to have this study cover this part if we have compounding conflict and sources of conflict. Second, there are other aspects that could impact this dynamic of conflicts. One is climate change and the impact that it has on access to resources for the herders, and conflict due to access to resources, and the lack of corridors because it's not only about agriculture, but it's about having those corridors with points for access to water that have been seen as a mitigating factor. So it's not any agriculture project, but I don't know how this was taken into account. With that, I've abused my chair role. I can turn to, yes, one question here, and then please, over to you. Yes?
Fascinating.
Microphone.
Fascinating presentation. I don't fully understand not fully familiar with the context, and I also arrived a bit late. So in political economy, one classic idea.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, Pablo Balan, Tel Aviv University. One way political economists think about how when development and conflict happen together is, okay, that's the case in stateless societies, but you're proposing this different channel. I understand that it's different mismatch. So I think it would be important to contrast your mechanism with this classic idea of, okay, development can create conflict in stateless societies that cannot adjudicate. It was in one of the first slides, you talk about surplus, but it wasn't like really clear at what timing does this surplus increase and who gets to appropriate that. And you're talking about expropriation by the state, not by third parties. So, and that's related to the question about measurement, what goes into the conflict measure, what are the parties in each conflict. So all of this goes to distinguish your mismatch mechanism from this more classic political economy idea.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Jennifer Alex Garcia from Oregon State. And I am also very interested in this climate change dynamic, because I do think it really has changed the way pastoralists move across the region. And I was wondering if you could maybe pick it up in a cohort effects type estimation over time, because your event studies are recentering everything around the date, right, of the start of the project. But you might expect that there are there's time varying heterogeneity in these effects that could be driven by climate change. Or alternatively, you could like maybe use climate shocks as another, I mean, I know you have many interactions, but this is maybe another way to get at the question of whether the underlying climatic situation is changing the way these kinds of projects interact.
This is, again, really interesting, and I'll avoid climate change just because I know you have another excellent paper on climate change and pastoral groups and violence. But my question is, so you kind of started off, you motivated the presentation by talking about how formal systems of property rights, which might make it easier to adjudicate these sorts of Coasian bargains that you're imagining, don't really work because pastoralist groups are constantly on the move, and you kind of follow by using these static shapefiles from the ethnographic atlas. So it seems like we're looking at the effect of projects in kind of these rainy season dryland pastures. But what about projects that are just over the border? So these projects that are in areas where you would expect to see during kind of the drier seasons the pastoralists go and move their animals. Do those have like a medium effect between these two groups? You might be able to get some causal leverage on that by looking at when these agricultural projects are situated right next to major watercourses, because those might be the ones that are especially blocking these kind of pathways that we were discussing earlier. So thanks, really cool.
Okay, will I respond to a couple of questions and then you can let me know what's on. Thanks everyone for the really helpful feedback, and this is still very much in progress, so all of this feedback will be incorporated. I will mention, because I have a microphone and an audience, we have another paper on climate change. So that's coming out at Restud, and we do exactly what you have in mind, thinking about, and the whole story there is that it's droughts in pastoral areas leading to conflict in neighboring agricultural areas, because the droughts in pastoral areas are forcing pastoralists to migrate sooner than they typically would, and if they arrive before the harvest rather than after the harvest, the cooperation has turned into competition. So that's what we find in that paper. So that's an answer for, is it Jen? Jen and Sukaina, that's an answer for both of you. All other points very well taken. It's very hard for us to observe how surplus is shared. And the best we can do is by looking at these pastoral projects that the World Bank is implementing as well. So I'm not saying that we can see everything, but that's one example. Am I out of time? No, sorry, I thought you were putting your hand up. So, and then on the other point that, yeah, I mean, these are places that have weaker state presence as well, so that could be a part of the story as well. But what's interesting is we're not seeing conflict that comes from other development projects in pastoral areas, right? So whether it's electricity or transport or anything like that. So it's not just contact with the state or economic development, it's something specific to this type of project. But again, point very well taken. And then a joint part, so Matthew and Sukaina both talking about blocking corridors and access to water. So that could happen on the agricultural side of the border, and we have evidence in favor of what you both suggested is potentially going on. We haven't actually connected it to sources of water explicitly, but that's a really good idea. But again, we have evidence that's consistent with the idea that these projects can also block important corridors on the agricultural side. We don't have good data on the corridors themselves. I don't know if, Ariel, if that's your next big project, is mapping transhumance corridors, but if someone could do that systematically, it would be really, really cool.
More and more regional pastoral project with the Kurdish, so we should be able,
that would be really great.
Not all in the whole region, but at least for sure in the Sahel at least. And
that would be really cool to see. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. Really, really thank you for the great feedback. Thanks.
So now we move to Ariel, who will talk about the landmine clearance and economic developments using Afghanistan as an example. So Ariel is development economist specialized in empirical microeconomics, geospatial impact evaluation, and randomized control trace. And Ariel heads the 8 Data Research and Evaluation Unit. Over to you, Ariel.
Thanks, and great to see you guys. Hopefully this will be a little bit more good news. I know in the conflict session sometimes that's gets a little depressing, but hopefully we'll see some conflict news in the better direction. This is joint work with lots of my colleagues at AData at William and Mary. Okay, so just a little bit about landmines and context here. This was all new to me when I started this just a few years ago, but landmines remain long after many wars end. As recently as 2021, there were still more than 100 million landmines scattered over nearly a third of the countries around the world. Obviously, these are dangerous to humans, right? lots of studies that are showing major risks to human life and health. They also appear, from the very limited evidence we have to date, to reshape how people behave around them naturally, where they farm, where they study, how they get around, where they choose to invest commercially. The interesting thing is that clearing these landmines is arduous and expensive. Okay? So while the landmines themselves to produce cost, in many cases now, less than $10 per unit to produce, removing them from an area often costs more than $1,000, right? And that's because we don't know where they're buried, right? That's the basic technology here, is the surprise element, right? And that makes it very difficult to remove them. The recent removal rates worldwide are on the order of 100 to 200,000 removed per year. Remember, 100 million landmines buried, 100 to 200,000 removed per year. Sorry, this is not yet the good news portion. I'm warming you up with the bad news part. Okay, while there are still 2 million more being buried every year, more so recently, of course, with the Ukraine and lots of other contexts. Even with no new mines planted, ignoring that, it would still take us more than 1,000 years to remove all the landmines that have already been buried at current rates. So these are major constraints we face, and the landmine removal policy debates have thus revolved around what to prioritize. If we're going to remove only 200,000, where should we focus our efforts, right? And so there are lots of debates here. Many of the debates have focused on urban versus rural and transport corridors versus everything else, if you will, right? So what do we need to focus on? There's really only been one study in the literature that's focused on landmine removal. There are a few earlier papers that looked at the, in a cross-sectional design, kind of with instrumental variables, where they believe landmines were buried and looked at effects of landmine existence. But the landmine removal question has only been studied by Chiavelli et al. With a panel design that's pretty similar in many ways to what we're going to do. But the limitation of this work is that it really only focused on using nighttime lights. And it does it in a context in Mozambique after a civil war concluded. Okay? In our sample, we're going to see in Afghanistan, only 16% of the cells are ever lit during our period, right? So the focus on nighttime lights naturally takes this prioritization debate about urban versus rural out of the question right away. So we're going to do better than that by trying to introduce daytime satellite imagery to try to look at what's happening in rural areas. As I mentioned, the focus on Mozambique and the other papers, you know, it's a super interesting context, but lots of the landmine removal questions that we have today are about whether we should prioritize countries with still active conflicts. And as a result, you know, that paper doesn't really help us get a handle on that. So we're going to look at a case in Afghanistan where there still very much is active conflict in the period we're going to look at. Okay. Oops, sorry. Wrong button. Okay. Afghanistan, this is like the worst history you're going to get, right? But I'm going to just try to do it in one slide. Most of the landmines start getting buried after 1979. In as early as 1989, after the departure of the Soviet troops, at that point, the international community begins this mine action program for Afghanistan that tries to start removing some of these landmines. It's pretty slow and disorganized for 2 decades. Until 2007, when the international actors kind of finally decide that they need to invest substantially more and they need local teams to go out and do much more of the surveying work. And as a result, we see a big ramp up of landmine removal efforts in Afghanistan in 2008 and later. That's the period we're going to focus on when most of the removal happens. One of the really interesting things is that this scale up also actually allows them to clear landmines in many rural areas. During those first 2 decades, the focus really was on urban areas and on corridors. So we can really try to get a handle on what's happening in the rural areas during this window. We managed to get data in an incredibly lucky spin for the science part of this in June of 2020. So just before Kabul fell to the Taliban, we were able to get this data. We would not have been able to get it 2 months later. So we're really thankful for that piece. We have data on nearly 18,000 landmine-related hazard sites, including the boundaries that were walked by the survey teams as they removed the landmines. They were compiled centrally by this DMAC agency in Afghanistan, but they were actually removed by a series of largely NGOs like Halo Trust and others who were doing the landmine clearance work and georeferencing them precisely to know exactly which areas they've been cleared. So this was an incentive compatibility for high quality georeference data on the ground along with the treatment information. We also know the exact dates at which they were cleared, so that's obviously really helpful for us as well. That clearance, this is Kabul province, so this gives you a sense about how much land was demined over this period. For causal identification, we're going to do what you've seen now nearly every other paper do, which is two-way fixed effects and Callaway and Santana, or whatever your favorite flavor of multi-way effects adjustments are. We're going to start by looking at the nighttime lights, just for comparability, again, with some of the prior work. And we're going to look at the nighttime lights in a cell, basically with the treatment status as being entirely cleared of all the landmine hazardous areas in that cell, beginning in that certain year. And we'll have this grid cell and then time fixed effects that can also vary by province and other higher level admin units. Treatment effects on nighttime lights, big and continuous. Right, so they begin really in the couple of years after, and they continue a decent amount past. We're a little bit limited because we're largely using the DMSP here, so we've got 5 years post-treatment, post the 2008 reform. But consistent again with what Chiavelli find in Mozambique, there are pretty big effects on economic production measured through nighttime lights immediately thereafter. Interestingly, those effects are concentrated in places that are more urban or have higher levels of baseline population and places closer to the roads, but they are non-zero even when you move to the lowest population quantiles or far away from the roads. So, doing it at the cell level rather than at more aggregate units like Chiavelli et al. Do, actually lets you see that there is some interesting stuff happening even away from cities and big roads. Okay. So getting away from the nighttime lights, what we are going to do is do some of our own remote sensing based work, largely using this Landsat 30-meter resolution data. We basically develop a land use, land cover classification that's going to use that portion of the Landsat that's the visible and near infrared. For various reasons, we're going to do this at 5-year intervals, starting back to 1995 and going to 2020. Most of what I'll show you is based on random forest models. For a variety of reasons, we focus on 3 big provinces for this portion for computational reasons. We developed our own training set, so we can't quite see them, but in red are like hand-drawn polygons that we used as the training and validation data sets for the random forest to categorize them into bare areas built up, et cetera. Most of what I'll show you focuses on the built up uses, so that's really conversion from what you can see again as bare earth or farmland into built up, like in column C, or sorry, in panel C. This is the resulting overlay here, and you've got that kind of time series moving counterclockwise. I blame my remote sensing colleague for the counterintuitive version, but in 1995, the orange is built up. The light green is and yellowish is farmland, and then grassland beyond it. And if you move this way, right, you can kind of see the rapid expansion of built up areas over this time frame around Kabul. And our question is going to be whether that coincides with the removal of landmines in the areas where this is happening. Interestingly, we see notable effects on, so notable increases in built up land use exactly in those areas where landmines are being cleared. So on the cleared areas themselves, we see switches into built up uses, right? Really also interestingly, these effects appear to be larger in places that had higher baseline conflict. So places that we might think about as normally as kind of more dangerous and thus less prioritized, even if we're looking at cities, those areas seem to be getting bigger knock-on development effects. Okay. The one thing that land use, land cover classifier that I just showed you isn't so great at doing is picking up in kind of the intensity of farming. It'll classify whether an area is farmland or not, but really the intensity of farming is not so well done there. So we opt for a different outcome measure using still that Landsat 30-meter resolution, but a normalized difference vegetation index, this kind of NDVI. This works pretty well because in Afghanistan, we're largely looking at wheat production, and NDVI in wheat in this context is pretty good still. So we're going to basically look at the seasonal peak of NDVI in each year in a 30-meter pixel, and we're going to aggregate that to the hazardous area, those polygons that I showed you before, by year. So that gives us about 4,000 hazardous areas that were initially classified as being intended for agricultural purposes by those NGOs that were doing the clearing. And we've got that for the 2005 to 2020 time series. Okay. And we do see important effects. They're not, I would say, giant. They're like modest effects on the order of saying that removing landmines allows about 10% of fields to be converted to actual productive wheat production. And there's lots of reasons why that 10% isn't higher, and especially, again, given climate change, there's not as much access to irrigation, and new irrigation on newly cleared lands is not so common in the Afghan context. But there's still kind of big benefits that are happening here. Okay, and then lastly, we've looked at the land use questions. Now, getting away from some of the remote sensing and thinking more about the conflict aspects here, you might think that the targeting of all of the landmine removal could follow conflict cycles, right? So it's only safe to send in the Halo Trust teams after conflict has subsided in an area. So we're going to start by looking at whether the pre-trends, if you will, in conflict prior to the onset of the demining are already falling as kind of one way to check this question. And then the other obvious question is whether the presence of conflict, whether kind of historically, so baseline conflict or even ongoing conflict, whether that changes the benefits from removing landmines, and whether the removal of the landmines themselves actually have some knock-on effects for conflict. So we're going to use UCDP data with all the usual assumptions and limitations that exists. We're going to largely do this different grid cell scales and then tie that together again geospatially with the hazardous areas. And what we find on this front is actually generally pretty good news. There's actually very little in the way of pre-trends, so we don't really see big dips in conflict triggering new landmine removal efforts. But we do see dips of conflict after the landmines are removed, right? So that's, I think quite interesting. They're also pretty well sustained with obviously some blips. This is not the perfect time series, but it's pretty good and it's continuing to head in the right direction, if you will. So no kind of mean reversion concerns you might have about, okay, this stays safe for a little bit, but then, countervailing forces jump back in. Sorry, and the last thing I would say, I didn't stick this in a slide, is that we actually do see reasonably large effects, even in places that had high baseline conflict, and even in some cases contemporaneous conflict. So the concern that the conflict aspect is going to wash out any of the benefits that you might have from economic production, whether that's in the cities or from new farming that you can do on the newly cleared land, doesn't seem to pan out. In fact, if anything, the biggest benefits seem to happen in those places that you might think about as otherwise the most dangerous, and the places that are otherwise least prioritized. So big kind of takeaways from this, we do see consistent effects from landmine clearance, both that are consistent with the recent other work. So that's, I would say, like good news in general, and hopefully more attention and more funding goes to landmine removal as a result of these. I think one of the interesting twists of this work, right, is to say that that landmine clearance needs to be probably more equitably distributed than it has been, and that prioritization should think about more concretely what happens away from those areas that are easiest to get to and that have been the most attention. And that we should consider safe ways to do landmine removal, even in places that have ongoing conflict, because that can actually reshape the trajectory of that conflict itself. Okay, I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much, Ariel. Unfortunately, I have to run, but Klaus will take over to organize the Q&A. Fascinating. I have one question for you, though, that I'll follow up with Klaus, is that usually what we see at the World Bank, land mining is part of a bigger effort to stabilize. So we do land mining, but demining, but we don't. Actually, we work with institutions that like UNMAS, for instance, that are specialized. But it's usually part of a bigger stabilization project. So it would be interesting to know what is the causality between the land demining itself, but as the bigger stabilization project. And I will follow up with Klaus. With that, thank you so very much. It was very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being an excellent chair to raise very challenging questions that also allow us to link that to World Bank work. So I think we very much appreciate that. With that, I think the floor is open for questions. Robert first, then you, and then here, let's go that route.
Thanks so much. I'm curious if you could give just a little bit more context on kind of how organizations like HALO prioritize exactly where they're going to engage in the demining, and whether there's any information about development plans locally that might be informing where they're going to target.
Juan Felipe Riaño, Georgetown University. Excellent work. I really like this idea of looking at beyond nightlight stuff. Two comments on that. One is related to a similar paper in Colombia by Juan Vargas and Manu Prem, looking at demining. Similar efforts, but I think your data is way better. Second comment related to the two types of demining that exist, military and humanitarian demining, and that aspect would be interesting to explore also in this context. And finally, related to a project of mine, sorry for the hat there, we have a project in Laos looking at the role of landmines in long-term development. And one of the things that is interesting in this context is whether or not this is affecting structural transformation, because, they're affecting land use. So yeah, that's basically it. Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed the presentation. I was wondering if there is information about the location of poppy crops in Afghanistan, because in Colombia, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has information on the location of coca crops. I know that in Afghanistan, the main illicit crop is poppy. So maybe you can also link these, the mining projects with land use on illicit crops, which is also closely linked with conflict.
Great talk. Really enjoyed that, Ariel. And my apologies in advance if you've already covered these two. But first, they're both about the conflict results. So the first one is you've shown us that the conflict results are not due to just clearance displacing conflict over time. but can you check to see if landmine clearance displaces conflict across space and to see if there are spillover effects? And then the other question, I'd love to hear your understanding of the conflict results. Like, what's the mechanism you have in mind? Is it that clearance promotes productive use of land, and then it's production that reduces the likelihood of conflict, so the opportunity cost story we talked about earlier? And if so, I wonder then, could you estimate the impact of production on conflict using the clearance as an instrument? That'd be a really interesting quantitative parameter to recover.
Okay, over to you.
Awesome, thank you. These are great questions. And I think this point about the bigger context of the stabilization is super interesting. There are a few big projects happening in the background that are supporting a lot of this work, and our identification is year by year, so it's kind of taking a lot of this institutional arrangements kind of as given, but we should exploit that definitely more. Robert, your question about the context of the targeting at the micro scale is super interesting to us. We actually, let me see if I can get the extra slides to come up. Maybe this one. Sorry, this is Kabul province. These are locations. In red are the locations post-2008, and then the green ones, and apologies for the red-green colorblind people in the audience, terrible, the pre-2008 locations. And you could see that they really were targeting kind of the urban center and the main corridors pre-2008, and they kind of expand from there. What we found super interesting is that when we tried to explain where they were targeting on the basis of a lot of local characteristics, we just couldn't do it very well. And in our discussions with Halo and others, we kept asking them, do you have criteria? Do you have all this? They never gave us anything that resembled anything that would go below the district scale. That kind of matches with this general kind of urbanization parameter being the dominant one, and below that there doesn't look like there's a lot that's shaping it, even at the, I would say, like kind of 5-year scales, which honestly is kind of what we're hoping to contribute to their discussion about, like, well, really, shouldn't we be doing better targeting at these finer scales? Partly because we're at aid data, we have geocoded aid data for Afghanistan. Neither the aid response to the demining, there doesn't look like there's much there, and it doesn't look like the placement of the aid shapes necessarily what's happening in terms of the response to the demining as well. So those are kind of interesting contextual factors. Also, thanks for the points about the Colombia, and I'd love to connect about the Laos work. I agree there's really interesting twists in the military and humanitarian elements. Most of what we've got in here is humanitarian, so most of the effects are being driven by that, I'd love to talk more about that. Thanks for the suggestion about Poppy. We have some good data from UNODC that we haven't had a chance to throw in here, but I agree, it could be definitely driving some of the land use results. And then lastly, the landmine clearance, the effects exist even at reasonably large, like 5 or 10 kilometer scales. So they're not necessarily concentrated, like we were worried, okay, are we going to cut it too finely if we look only on the plots themselves? Even more interestingly, they're not necessarily super well correlated with the changes in nighttime lights. So I don't think the story is entirely that the landmines are creating new economic opportunities that are disincentivizing conflict, kind of along some of the other channels that we talked about. But there does seem to be at least a partially independent mechanism through which then the actual clearance reduces the probability of new conflict, even separate from whether or not you can produce stuff on that land immediately. So we're kind of puzzled by that and curious about it. But we'll see if we can shove that into this paper, or maybe that's a branch off. But thanks again for the great comments.
Thank you very much. So we are right on time, and please enjoy the coffee.